Greetings and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today, as he does most every week when he's not taking his month-long vacations in Europe, is the Center Square Washington, D.C. bureau chief, Casey Harper. We're recording this on Friday, June 30th. Casey, we're 3.5 years removed from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, yet we cannot stop talking about it, stop writing about it, and for good reason. This week, you wrote at thecentersquare.com about a congressional investigation into teachers' unions and their influence over COVID school closures during the height of the pandemic. What's going on here?
Yeah, this has been a story we've been following, as you said, for a while now. And it began when we looked into the donations that teachers' unions had been giving and started to connect the dots that teachers' unions had given about $20 million to Democrats. And what had happened in the last, the 2020 campaign. And what happened, right after that in regards to COVID? Well, we're learning more and more from, testimony and from emails and investigations that teachers unions, especially the American Federation of Teachers, which is led by Randi Weingarten, AFT, for example, had a lot of influence over federal recommendations for when schools should reopen, right? So one, there's the question of should they have had so much influence, had basically a direct line. Weingarten had basically a direct line to Rochelle, Walensky, the CDC director, and they were talking on the phone pretty regularly. So why is a teachers union rep, which is basically a political wing, a soft wing of the Democratic Party, funneling millions of dollars to Democratic candidates, almost nothing to Republican candidates? And they have no health expertise. How are they involved in working so closely with health officials on school reopening guidance? So it's kind of a question of influence, money, and politics there. And then the other thing that we've learning, which is more tragic really, is just the severe learning loss, Dan. We've written about this also at thecentersquare.com. But closing schools during COVID, we won't get into all the health things of why or why not that was done. And it did vary based on state to state. But the numbers are in, and it shows that closing these schools had devastating learning effects on kids. Kids cannot just sit at home on their computer and still learn. If there was ever any doubt about that, anyone who has kids or younger siblings or cousins would know that a 8-year-old can't sit on a computer all day without being in a classroom and being forced to learn. But I'll give you a quick stat and then pass it off to you. Average scores for 9-year-old students in 2022 declined by 5 points in reading and 7 points in mathematics compared to 2022. That's the largest score decline in reading in decades since 1990. So we saw the biggest score decline in decades because of closing schools. And why did we close schools? Well, the federal government says it was for health reasons, but we're learning more and more. It may have been because teachers unions, the teachers in them, were so scared of COVID that they didn't want to go back to work. And they kind of wielded their political influence to the tune of $20 million to keep schools closed longer. That's kind of the theory that lawmakers are now increasingly investigating, in particular that relationship between Weingarten and Rochelle Walensky.
What's really concerning about what you just said a moment ago, this latest school report card assessment of schools nationwide, there was hope. We all know about the learning loss. There was definitely significant learning loss during school closures in the pandemic. But here we are now in 2023, and the latest data is showing student scores continue to decline. So there hasn't been any kind of post-pandemic recovery, right, even though there's been in-person learning now for the most part for well over a year, couple years. Things aren't turning around there. So that is kind of scary. So what's next with this? What does Congress hope to accomplish with this investigation?
In some sense, the damage is already done, right? I think that's kind of what you're getting at. These numbers are really bad. It's not surprising to me. These 10-year-olds can't do it. Kids want to run around and play and watch TV. They don't want to, do this kind of thing. So it shouldn't be shocking. Kids have to be in school. But so what's going to happen now? Well, we're kind of in this giant autopsy of what happened in COVID. On our one of our other podcasts, we're going to talk about how much money was lost. Hundreds of billions of dollars was lost in COVID era spending. So I think we're just looking at how does our federal government respond to emergencies? And it's not a good look. And how can we in the future respond better next time there is a crisis? Maybe we don't shut down everything, keep kids out of school, spend trillions of dollars that then, nearly 20% of which is in some cases is lost to waste, fraud, and abuse. We've got to just try to, I think, do the best we can to learn from our mistakes from this crisis so we don't repeat them.
So, Casey, I want to stay on COVID, but briefly segue to another congressional investigation related to the origins of COVID. You wrote about it this week at thecentersquare.com. Don't have a ton of time. But what's going on with this investigation into Dr. Anthony Fauci and the possible federal government's suppression of the origin theory that it came from the Wuhan lab?
Yeah, this is another great example of the autopsy. How did the federal government handle information? Because we know they suppressed a lot of information around the vaccine, around the Wuhan lab, and then a lot of the concerns about both those things turned out to be more valid than was originally said, right? So in the case of Fauci, we know that Fauci did several interviews where he just said the Wuhan lab leak theory, the idea that Chinese scientists may have inadvertently created and released the COVID-19 virus, was just ridiculous. The mainstream media, in part because of Fauci's insistence, said it was basically a conspiracy theory, a myth. Washington Post called it a fringe theory, and they just blew that horn. And even if at that time, if you had written something on social media, you could have got censored or taken down, or at the very least just mocked as an idiot for saying something like this. And now the FBI is saying this, that the lab leak is the most likely. We've seen more and more evidence at seemingly almost every month that it was more and more likely that it came from a Wuhan lab. So the question is, how could Dr. Fauci suppress this information? What grounds did he have to say that the lab leak was not the origin of COVID? And then the last thing, which I'm not sure we'll ever get to the bottom of, but lawmakers really want to, is what financial interest could Fauci have had in this, in the sense that the U.S. government was funding this lab, right? So it seems very possible that the U.S. government funded the lab that created COVID. Now, we weren't the only one funding it, and there's a question of, were we funding the specific research in this question here? You can fund different parts of research at a lab, and it was a Chinese lab, so of course they were funding a lot of it too. But I think there's a kind of culpability. Was Fauci and the federal research grants somehow responsible for what happened?
I don't know if that we'll ever get a firm, definitive answer to this. Where did COVID-19 start? It sounds like the preponderance of evidence, or at least most now, are leaning towards the Wuhan lab. But I think because of this, essentially the story that was told to the American people during the height of the pandemic by Dr. Anthony Fauci and others, Congress needs to continue its investigation into this. But Casey, we are out of time. To our listeners, you can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Casey Harper, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.